We welcome you to the program today. This continues the series of the Book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Last time we looked at the vanity of life in verses 1 through 11 of chapter 1, and the vanity of wisdom and knowledge in verses 12 through 18. Today we will continue with Ecclesiastes 2 and verses 1 to 11, the vanity of mirth. Verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth, therefore enjoy pleasure. But surely this also was vanity. What profit has a man? If you look back at Ecclesiastes 1 and 14, he says, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? Solomon said, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for wind. Ecclesiastes 1 and 14. Solomon set his heart to know wisdom. And so he said, look, I have obtained greatness, and I've gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Ecclesiastes 1 and 16. He perceived that this also was, quote, grasping for wind. Ecclesiastes 1:17. From his much wisdom and knowledge also came much grief and sorrow. Verse 18. Solomon now set his heart to know pleasure. He said in his heart, come now, I would test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. Mirth is defined as gladness, as shown by or accompanied with laughter. Another version reads, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. Did he find profit? Surely this also was vanity. Proverbs 14:13, Solomon writes, even in laughter, the best heart or the heart may sorrow, and the end of mirth may be grief. Chapter 2, verse 1. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? He found that attempting to satisfy oneself with laughter was madness. This was extreme folly. He also found that mirth, too, was vanity, saying, what does it accomplish? The implied answer is that mirth accomplishes nothing. Another version reads, what use is it? So according to Solomon's teaching, the vanity is attempting to find profit in the works of man in this world apart from God. That last part is important, apart from God. And so as he tried the various things of life, his wisdom and his wealth and his mirth or pleasure, and we see that he tried all those things apart from God amounted to nothing in his mind. What use is it? Vanity of vanity, he says. Verse 3, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what is good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. And so Solomon searched in his heart how to gratify or how to satisfy his flesh with wine. He did this all the while guiding his heart, he said, with wisdom. The term gratify is defined as to give satisfaction. It's also rendered in other versions as to stimulate or to cheer. Perhaps Solomon attempted to achieve gratification through wine or drinking of wine in moderation. However, he didn't stop there. It also says that he searched in his heart how to lay hold on folly. In this context, to lay hold on folly may be defined as to know or consider or to understand folly or foolishness. Chapter 1:17 or chapter 2:12. And so this may indicate that he acted without restraint. One version reads, embracing folly. And so while he began to he searched in his heart how to satisfy or gratify his flesh with wine. At first, it appears he did so in moderation, and second, he did so in embracing folly. What did Solomon write in Proverbs 20 and verse 1? Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. And so Solomon, he searched his heart to try to find the answer to where is the gratification, where is the satisfaction, where is the profit in the works of men, in the things of mankind. He searched for the answer. And apart from God, vanity, pointless, meaningless in his mind. And so he teaches in the book of Ecclesiastes. So he sought the answer to the question of Ecclesiastes 1:3. And this is an important question because he keeps going back to it. What profit has a man? Ecclesiastes 1 and 3. What profit has a man under the sun in this world? Ultimately, apart from God, he wanted to see what was good for men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. Man has a brief life in this world. And so another translation reads the few years of their lives. Literally, it's days. And so another version reads the few days of their life. And so during man's brief life, what is good for men to do? And so here he's trying these various things. And in this chapter, testing his heart with mirth and pleasure and wine and these things, trying to see if there could be satisfaction, gratification, if there was ultimately any profit in it in this world apart from God. Verses 4 to 6, he says, I made my works great. I built myself houses, planted myself vineyards. And so in verses 4 through 6, he tries great works in order to satisfy his flesh, to try to find satisfaction apart from God in this world. He made great works, he said. One version reads, I undertook great projects. And so these included building himself houses, like we see in 1 Kings 7, 1 to 12, and planting himself vineyards, like we see in Song of Solomon in chapter 8 and verse 11. And so he tried building great structures, building himself houses, planting himself vineyards, perhaps grapes from which to produce the wine that he tried earlier. Verse 5, he said, I have made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. And so he made himself gardens or orchards, like we see in Song of Solomon 4:12 to 15. The orchard in this place is a place where trees are grown, fruit trees. Another version reads park. And so these parks. And so in these parks or these orchards, he planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. He perhaps surrounded his houses with these fruit trees, these gardens and orchards, these parks. The term paradise comes from a word meaning park or garden. So the point of these passages, he's trying it all in order to try to find some profit to the works of men, to try to find some satisfaction, ultimately apart from God. Each time he keeps coming up, vanity of vanities. Verse 6, I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. And so he made himself water pools, or these ponds of water, these reservoirs. The growing trees of the groves, he used these pools to irrigate those groves, those forests, gardens, and orchards that he made. Verse 7, he said, I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. And yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. So it describes how he acquired male and female servants. He also had servants who were born in his house. His servants would tend to his properties and his possessions. He had possessions of herds and flocks. His herds would include cattle, and his flocks may have included both sheep and goats. He said he had greater possessions than all who were before him in Jerusalem. And so here he describes how he had it all. He had all the things that men of his day might search to try to fill their lives with in order to find some meaning. He gathered for himself silver and gold. And so he said here, I gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the lights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So now describes how he gathered for himself silver and gold, special treasures of kings, provinces, acquired male, female singers. He had his entertainment. He tried that too. I want you to remember that according to 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 12, at the beginning of the reign of Solomon, we see that Solomon asked God for wisdom. God had given Solomon a wise and understanding heart, as he humbly requested, 1 Kings 3 and 12. He also gave Solomon riches and honor, according to 1 Kings 3 and 13. However, later during his reign, sometime later in his reign as king of Jerusalem, of Israel, Solomon tested his heart with wisdom along with riches. We see in passages like 1 Kings 4, 20 to 21, 24 to 25. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 16 and 16, how much better to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding than to be chosen rather than silver. And so here we recognize in Proverbs that he had written by the wisdom of God that it's better to have wisdom than to have silver and gold. Here we see at some time in his life, which Solomon writes about here in Ecclesiastes, he tried silver and gold. He found wisdom to be better. Principally, wisdom beginning with the fear of God, of living according to God. In addition to acquiring singers for his delight, it says he also acquired musical instruments of all kinds. This particular passage is difficult to translate, and so there are some variations between various English versions in this passage. The meaning of the Hebrew here is rather difficult. And so the accompaniment of instruments does go along with the singers that he acquired, male and female singers. However, as I mentioned, the exact meaning is difficult to know for certain. There are some other suggestions. For example, some versions read many concubines or a harem. And so it is true that Solomon had concubines, 1 Kings 11 and 3. Here he speaks of the delights of sons of men. And so this may refer generally to all the delights and pleasures of men. And generally speaking, it would also include those more specific things that he might test himself with, such as musical instruments for his pleasure, his entertainment, and also women as well. So he tried everything. And that's the point of the passage here in verses 1 through 11. At some time during his life, we say he tried these things. Now, as he's writing Ecclesiastes, he's remembering how he tried those things, and he's teaching others so that they might learn from his teaching, from his example of things to do and, unfortunately, things not to do. Verse 9, he said, so I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And so he says how he excelled more than all who were before him in Jerusalem. He had great works of properties and possessions, silver and gold. This could include not only other kings, but also men of wealth. And so he said, also my wisdom remained with me. So this was the same wisdom that he had while he searched in his heart earlier in chapter 2 and verse 3. Solomon tested his heart. He tested his heart with wisdom and knowledge and mirth and pleasure, property and wealth. He tried all these things. And yet, where was the profit in any of these works, even wisdom, apart from God? Proverbs 9 and verse 10, Solomon wrote in the book of Proverbs, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." And so there is wisdom, and then there is the wisdom that is the principal thing in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom that begins with the fear of God. Certainly there is profit in that. Verse 10, "Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor." And so whatever his eyes desired, whatever he saw that he wanted, he did not keep from his eyes. Nothing was refused. One version reads, "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired." Yet remember what he wrote in his introduction to the book, that he learned the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 8. And so we see the wisdom that he used here in Ecclesiastes 1:8, that eye is never satisfied, the ear is never satisfied with hearing, the eye is never satisfied with seeing. And yet, what did he do? Well, at one point in his life, he tested himself, his heart. Whatever his eyes saw that he desired, he did not keep that from them. And so whatever he heard that he wanted, and whatever he saw that he wanted. And as king, he had the resources. He had the power. And so he did not withhold his heart from any pleasure. And with all the labor, all of his labor, all his work, his heart rejoiced. He said, "And this was my reward from my labor." This was it. And of course, his work apart from God, if that's all he had, he might have some pleasure in those things, but whatever that was his reward. It extended no farther. Think about the New Testament. Think about what Jesus said. Jesus rebuked the men, those men who hypocritically gave and fasted and prayed. Those were even good things. Those were good things. He said repeatedly to his disciples, "Surely I say to you, they have their reward." But in the words of Solomon, what they were doing was vanity. They did what they did, not because it was righteous and the will of God, but because they sought some reward here in this world. They had some other motive apart from doing good or apart from doing the will of God. And so Jesus said, "Surely I say to you, they have their reward." So whatever they got from giving, fasting, and praying, perhaps the attention of men, of having people look up to them or having people look at them as being righteous, though they were self-righteous and hypocritical, Jesus said they had their reward. If that's what they wanted, that's what they got. That's all they got. The reward of the hypocrite was not from God, was not from the Father. Verse 11, he says, "Then I looked on all the works that my hand had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun." After testing his heart with mirth and pleasure, he found that all his extravagant efforts were vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Again, remember that important phrase, under the sun, in this world, apart from God. Again, I return your attention to Ecclesiastes 1 and 3. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? As he tried the various things that we see here in verses 1 through 11, there were the times that he received some kind of pleasure from what he did. However, as he tested those things in his heart, he tried those things out in this world, he found that there was no pleasure, there was no profit ultimately under the sun. He saw those things as futile and fleeting and passing, temporary things, which would one day end, even for the king. Number 2, we see the wise and the fool compared in verses 12 through 17. Verse 12, then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. So what more can man do who comes after the king? No one would be able to surpass his pursuit of fulfillment. With unlimited resources as king, he denied himself nothing. Consider all that he did in testing his heart with mirth and pleasure. What more could be done? The best one could do in search for satisfaction was what he had already done. Ecclesiastes 1 and 17, he said, I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also was grasping for the wind. Verse 13, then I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. And so even wisdom without the fear of God excels folly, foolishness. As he set his heart to know wisdom and to know folly, he saw that wisdom excels folly. There's more gain in wisdom than in folly. And wisdom is better than the folly. Both wisdom and folly are described as grasping for the wind. Again, futility. Have you ever tried to grasp a hold of the wind? That's what he's talking about by this expression. Also, he found that in much wisdom is much grief. That's true of a lot of things. We try to fill our lives with things that we think will bring us satisfaction, and oftentimes they bring us grief and sorrow. And that's what he found in wisdom without the fear of God. And yet, wisdom was better than folly in that the wise can at least see where he's going. Ecclesiastes 2:14. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yep, I perceive that the same event happens to them all. And so the wise can see, but the fool walks in darkness. However, he perceived that the same event still happens to them all. There's one fate. There's the same fate, the same event, and that event is death. Ecclesiastes 2:16. Verse 15, he said, so I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity. And so he says that the same fate that happens to the fool will also happen to him. What then does he gain by being so very wise? He concludes, this also is vanity. Verse 16, for there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. In verse 11, chapter 1, verse 11, he said, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. So what event or fate happens to both the wise and to the fool? Both will die. In this context, to die and to be forgotten are parallel. Man, whether wise or fool, will not live forever in this world, under the sun, under heaven. Since death comes to both the wise and to the fool, why should the wise be thought any better than the fool? And so whether you're a wise man without the fear of God or you're a foolish man, while it'd be better to be wise than the fool, we see that both will still die. In this context, the man is forgotten in the sense that man will die. However, this term forgotten is often used to refer to simply losing the remembrance of something or forgetting something. Remembrance is not forever. It's not lasting or enduring. It is true that the wise, like the fool, will not be remembered forever. However, consider King Solomon, who died and who was remembered. He was mentioned by name in the New Testament 12 times, about 1,000 years later, after his death. That's amazing. Jesus Christ, in teaching his disciples, speaks of the glory, wisdom, and greatness of Solomon in Matthew 6:29, 12:42, Luke 11:31, and in 12:27. However, it is also true that the vast number of people are forgotten. If not for the enduring word of God, would even Solomon in all his glory be remembered today? Probably not. Think of the people recorded in the scriptures which are only preserved in the scriptural record. Some people are just mentioned by name, and that's all we know of them in the Bible. So here in chapter 2 and verse 16, there's no more remembrance of the wise more than the fool forever. He says, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come, and how does a wise man die? As the fool. There's the point. That whether fool or wise, there's something that happens to all will die. All will be forgotten. And that's the meaning of that passage. Verse 17, therefore I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for wind. So at some time in his life, the time that he's writing about here, he even hated life. His worldly pursuits for satisfaction in the world were distressing to him. I could imagine how, just from reading the passage, how frustrating that must have been. Other versions read grievous. And so they were distressing, they were grievous. And so he concludes that all is vanity. Number 3, what we leave behind. Verses 18 to 26. Verse 18, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. So Solomon found by experience that the work done under the sun was vanity. This was further compounded by the thought of leaving his work to the foolish who did not work for what they had. Chapter 2, 18 to 23. He says, then I hated all my labor. That is, he hated the fruit of his labor. While he had rejoiced in his work, which was his reward, he was now troubled at the thought of leaving it to the man who would come after him. To whom would all the fruit of his labor go after his decease? And so his joy turned to bitterness. Setting out to test his heart with mirth and pleasure, he became great and excelled. Chapter 2, 9 to 11. He denied his eyes nothing. He refused his heart no pleasure. He wrote in chapter 2 and 10, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Chapter 2 and verse 11, he says, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. It appears that Solomon may have had some misgivings about leaving his heritage to his son Rehoboam, who would reign in his place after his decease. 1 Kings 11:42-43, it says, and the period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. Verse 19, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled and which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. So Solomon was wise as he worked during his life. Will the man who comes after him be wise or fool? Whether a wise man or a fool, he still will rule over all his labor. He says this is vanity. This makes me think of the man of the parable that Jesus taught of the rich fool, the foolish man of the parable, who lived his life obtaining property and possessions only to die during the night. He had great plans for what he was going to do. He had so much stuff that he was ready to tear down his barns and build bigger in order to hold it all. But something happened that night. God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? Luke 12:20. Jesus concluded, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. That man of the parable was physically rich. He was rich under the sun. He was rich in this world during his life. However, he was not rich towards God. Where was his fear of the Lord? That reminds me of what we see here in Ecclesiastes. Chapter 2 and verse 20, he says, therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. He turned aside his heart to despair as he thought of all the labor worked during his life. Any hope he had of his works living on with the wise as his heritage was gone. Verse 21, for there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. So he's saying here that there is the man who works during his life, labors with wisdom and knowledge and skill. To him, it was only vanity, but a great evil too, in his mind, that he must leave his heritage to someone who has not labored for it, who has not exercised wisdom and knowledge and skill and working for it. The idea that he must leave his heritage or his legacy, leave everything, leave all that he owned behind. You can't take it with you. Despite all your wealth and success in business, this is true. You must leave it to someone else. Vanity. Life is more, though, than these things. Now, if life was not more than these things, vanity of vanity, always vanity. But to the good, to those who fear God and follow his word, life is more than those things. Proverbs 23:4-5, Solomon wrote, do not overwork to be rich. Because of your own understanding, cease. Would you set your eyes on that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away as an eagle towards the heaven. And so here we see the wisdom of Solomon as he wrote in the book of Proverbs, do not overwork to be rich. Because of your own understanding, cease. And so there's a lesson that we see Solomon learning as he records his things of his life in the book of Ecclesiastes. He learned that lesson. He learned it the hard way too, as we see through the book here. He looks in verse 22, and he says, for what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, for which he has toiled under the sun? He looks at man who has devoted such great energy and effort while living in this world. What has he to show for it when his life is over? A man ought to work. A man ought to work for what he has, for food and for drink, for a place to live. However, do not overwork to be rich. Because of your own understanding, cease. Life is more than these things. Hopefully, we learn that sooner rather than later. It's not wrong to be rich. However, to make riches the purpose of life is vanity. Verse 23, he says, for all his days are sorrowful and his work burdensome. Even in the night, his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. And so he describes his days as being sorrowful, painful. Think about the person who's only concerned with this life, with no thought to God and his service or his own soul. His days are sorrowful. His word is burdensome, and he is restless at night. How many restless nights are spent in worry about losing what you have obtained or how to get more? In verses 24 to 26, we see how Solomon learned what he believed was from the hand of God. He said, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. So this is the satisfaction that comes to a man who works for a living. He enjoys eating and drinking the food and the drink for which he's labored. And he saw that this was a blessing from God. The text reads, his soul should enjoy in his good labor. Other versions read, tell himself that his labor is good. Find enjoyment in the toil. Find satisfaction in his own work. Some have argued that Solomon is saying that the best philosophy is to eat, drink, and to be merry. If true, he was in error. I do not think this is what he was saying. This is the same kind of philosophy that we see as the rich man in the parable of the rich fool. I think simply here that he's saying that in this life that we work for a living, we enjoy the things that we work for, and we count the things that we have and the life that we have as a blessing from God. This is the gift of God. Luke 12 and 12, Jesus records in the parable, so you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And we see how that the foolish man died that night. And then who did his works go to? Verse 25, he says, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? He was the best one to determine what man was able, without the hand of God, to be content in enjoying the fruit of his labors. And so he says, who can have enjoyment more than I? There's some manuscripts that read without him, and I think this fits very well. Either way, it's true. One, you have Solomon as king. He had unlimited resources. He had power and authority as king. And so he had the ability, the resources to deny himself nothing. And so he did not deny himself anything. He tried all those things. And he found that without the fear of God, keeping his commandments, these things were vanity. However, this passage here, he describes in the passage, who can have enjoyment more than I, or as some versions read, without him. And so, who can eat and who can have enjoyment without God? Apart from God, who can find true contentment? Not Solomon. He tried. And there are people today that have to learn the hard way, and they find out sometimes towards the end of their life. Solomon here, most likely writing this book towards the end of his life. Verse 26, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and collecting. that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The satisfaction that comes to a man who works for a living is a blessing by the hand of God. Ecclesiastes 2:24. God gives the blessing to those who are good in his sight. However, the sinner, the one who lives only for possessions, will one day give his possessions over to someone else. He is behaving foolishly. Again, as Jesus taught in the New Testament, life is more than these things. Man can chase any dream that he has, but apart from the hand of God, there's only vanity, according to Solomon. For the sinner who thinks he can have enjoyment apart from God, vanity and grasping for the wind. We'll leave you with a couple proverbs from the book of Proverbs today. Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. The idea that yes, a good man provides for his family, but here, secondly, he describes the sinner who stores up these things only to give away these things after he dies. They go to someone else, being without thought of what lies ahead beyond death. Proverbs 28 and verse 8, one who gathers his possessions by usury and extortion gathers it for him who will pity the poor. And so here we see that there are two different perspectives in life. There are those, as he describes here, as the sinners who gather for themselves during their life with no thought of their soul, no thought beyond this world. And to Solomon, that was vanity. Yes, they may have taken some gratification in the work that they did during this life, but ultimately this life eventually ends. And then what? To whom will those things that they work for go? There's also the man who fears God. He also works. He works for the things that he has. He also takes pleasure in those things. But in his mind, as a believer, and fearing God, he counts them as a blessing from God. He counts the short life perhaps that he has, as a blessing from God, and ultimately knows that his spirit will return to God who gave it. We hope that this lesson has been helpful today. As I mentioned last week, there's a lot to learn, a lot to contemplate in the book of Ecclesiastes, and I think a lot of value, benefit for us today. We invite you to return next time as we study Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we hope that you have a wonderful week. Thank you for coming today.